Good morning, everyone, and can I welcome you to the 16th meeting of 2025 of the Economy and the Fair Work Committee. We have apologies this morning from Willie Coffey, but we are joined by Bob Doris, who is substituting for Kevin Stewart today, and by Claire Baker, who is substituting for Daniel Johnson. I'm also pleased to welcome Stephen Kerr to the committee this morning. Our first item of business is a decision to take items 3 and 5 in private. Are members content to take these items in private? Okay. Thank you very much indeed. Our next item of business is an evidence session on Grangemouth's industrial future. In November 2023, it was publicly confirmed that the refinery would transition to a finished fuels import terminal and distribution hub. And in 2024, in September, it was announced that this would take place during the second quarter of 2025, with the refining at the site now ceasing. The findings of a feasibility study into options for the industrial future of Grangemouth Project Willow were published in March, and I'm delighted to welcome our panel this morning: Michael Shanks, MP, Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State, Minister for Energy, and Camilla Peary, Deputy Director for Energy Security with the UK Government. Thank you very much indeed for joining us this morning. As always, I'll appeal to members to keep your questions as short as possible and also our answers as concise as possible. And I'd like to invite the Minister to make a short opening statement.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to the committee. I'll keep my opening statement brief as well on those instructions. Can I say, firstly, it's a pleasure to be in front of a Scottish Parliament committee again. I think the second in the 9 months that I've been in this role, which I think kind of demonstrates the reset in our relationship with the devolved parliaments. I want to begin in this evidence session by saying what I've said a number of times in the past, which is that we are obviously deeply disappointed as a government that the Grangemouth refinery has closed. And from the outset, coming into government, we have been determined to stand with the workers and to do whatever we can to find a solution to this. And I'm sure we'll get into much of the detail of that in this evidence session. I do want to say that coming into government, it was very clear that Grangemouth was going to be an immediate priority for us, but there was no plan in place from the previous government. And so we swiftly worked across government, first of all, to expand the Falkirk and Grangemouth growth deal with additional money, working with the Scottish Government, but also, I think, crucially, to put in place tailored support for the workforce and retraining support. And really that has been critical to all the work that we've been doing, partly around finding an investable future for the site, but also making sure that those workers who are incredibly skilled and experienced also have a sustainable future. And of course, the other thing we launched, which could have been launched a considerable time before we came into government, but which we worked with the Scottish Government to fund, was Project Willow, which was a £1.5 million feasibility study on the industrial options for the Grangemouth site. As you'll have read in the report, it's a very detailed report outlining 9 potential options and a series of recommendations around that, and we've been working forward now on how we take that work forward. And crucially also, on top of that, the government has made an unprecedented commitment, the first time ever that the National Wealth Fund has made a commitment ahead of an actual proposition being on the table, and the Prime Minister committed £200 million from the National Wealth Fund for an investable proposition at Grangemouth, and that is really the first time we have ever made that commitment. And that is, as the Prime Minister said, an indication that Grangemouth is a site of enormous opportunity, and we see it as a really crucial investment opportunity for the government as well. More recently, myself and the Cabinet Secretary for Energy in the Scottish Government have been working very closely on dealing with the propositions that have come forward. Scottish Enterprise is taking a leading role in looking at the detail of those, and I can say today that they've received 66 inquiries. Clearly, some of those are more likely to proceed than others, but the fact that there have been 66 inquiries, I think, does demonstrate that there is a serious appetite for investing in Grangemouth. And today is the first formal meeting of the Grangemouth Investment Task Force, which the Secretary of State for Energy and Net Zero, Ed Miliband, will be chairing alongside myself and Gillian Martin. And then on the training side, which I know will be of interest to this committee, the training guarantee that we put in place working with the Scottish Government, clearly with skills being devolved, we have announced today that 184 workers through that have now begun training to help them transition into new jobs. And there's an even wider group than that who have completed some of the assessments for training that they might need in the future. And in all of this, we've worked closely with the trade unions, with the local community, with local businesses who have taken on many of the workers from Grangemouth to make sure that there is as good a transition as there possibly can be. But I come back to the point at the beginning that I made, that while we are hugely positive about the future potential of Grangemouth, we're clearly disappointed at the way the closure has happened. We wish we had been doing some of the work that we're doing now 5 years ago, where this could have been a really serious transition, rather than what we have seen. That is a lesson, I think, for the future, and for both our governments to continue working closely together to make sure that this doesn't happen again. I reiterate the point that Grangemouth is a hugely positive investment opportunity. It is really important that we all talk about the upside of the potential investment at Grangemouth so that we can get the best possible investors coming forward to develop that site. We're really excited about that opportunity. Obviously, that goes hand in hand with huge disappointment for the workers who have lost their jobs and for the refinery itself. But we are determined as a government to work with the Scottish Government to deliver the jobs and the opportunities that come sustainably into the future. And I look forward to your questions today.
Thank you very much indeed for that. Minister, can I ask the Deputy Convener to kick off our questions this morning?
Good morning. Thank you for joining us. I'd just like to speak to Michael the man, as it were, rather than the Minister. What would you like to say to the workers at the refinery and the town of Grangemouth and Scotland, the country, for the loss of their remaining refinery, just as a man rather than as a Minister?
Well, thank you for the question, Deputy Convener. I have to say, I think the man and the Minister are the same, so I don't think there's a different answer. I would say what I said to the workers when I met them at Grangemouth, which is clearly any job losses in any sector of our economy are hugely disappointing and devastating for those workers and for their families and for the community that they come from. So not for a second do I underestimate the impact that job losses have on individuals and on their families.
Would you like to apologise?
Well, we came into government 9 months ago and we have done everything we possibly can to support the workforce, to try and find a way through keeping the refinery going as long as possible. But I'd be really clear with you on this, that this did not suddenly occur in July of last year.
I realise
sorry,
that.
if I can maybe just finish the point. You've asked me two questions.
You're the accountable.
You've asked me two questions now and not let me answer either of them. So
you've immediately gone into Michael the Minister. I can tell you categorically, and I've put it on the record, both my anger and my significant disappointment at what has happened, and all of us in politics need to play our part in taking accountability and responsibility for this situation, for the people that work there and for the people in the town and for Scotland. So I can put it on the record that I feel I've done everything I can, but I take responsibility and accountability for that because I'm an elected politician. Do you?
Well, can I once again say thank you for asking me to come here and give evidence. I'm quite keen to give evidence if that's possible. So let me just explain, because this is, you're right, is a really serious opportunity, and I think it's one we should explore in detail rather than quick answers.
I'll move on to the next question.
I would just say,
Okay.
In answer to your actual question, I can't tell you how much this government has spent in time and workforce on finding solutions to these issues, more than any other issue that we have faced as a government in the past 9 months. From the Secretary of State having more meetings on this, I think, than anything else, to me meeting almost every single week on this question, to various parts of the UK government working with the Scottish Government more closely than on anything to find solutions to these issues. But we could not turn around what has been a long-standing issue at that refinery in 9 months. And what I say is not a political answer about passing responsibility. It's a reality that years ago we knew that the situation at Grangemouth was precarious and the previous government did nothing about that. Now, I wish we had been in power and worked with the Scottish Government more closely. I know the Scottish Government would have been interested in funding Project Willow at an earlier stage, but the UK Government did not support them on that. I wish we had done that earlier, and that is a deep regret, but I'm afraid it's not a regret that I have complete control over, and we have done everything we can since coming into power to do what we can to keep the refinery going, but then also to support the workforce and to deliver a sustainable future in what comes after, because that's what we owe the community of Grangemouth, a viable, sustainable industrial future on the site long into the future.
I'm sure your remarks will be noted. What I wanted to pick up on is there's clearly a power imbalance between INEOS as a landlord and any projects that come through. What assessment have you made of the risks of them being the landlord, and what's your current approach to that?
Well, I think there's two things to say. I mean, I would agree that crucially, obviously, the role that INEOS plays as a landlord means that any of the opportunities that come forward on the INEOS site directly, we are going to have to work to make sure that those ideas can be progressed. And we've been really clear with INEOS so far that we either need them to come on as a partner and help deliver these, or we are going to have some serious conversations about the use of the land in the future. Clearly, it is their land, so it's not as easy as just the government saying we want these projects to proceed. But we do need to be really quite serious about saying we want an investable future here, and if these projects are credible and ready to be delivered, we don't want INEOS to be a barrier to that. And I think it's really important to say we haven't got to that stage in those conversations yet because we haven't got propositions quite at that stage. The second thing I would say is that there are also proposals coming forward for the wider Grangemouth area that aren't just on the INEOS land, and I think we are looking at this holistically as the whole Grangemouth cluster to see if there are projects that can fit onto other parcels of land as well. But I think it is a really important point, and our engagement with INEOS is not going to end now just on the question of the refinery. Clearly, we're going to take an active role in what comes next as well.
And the recent Scottish Affairs Select Committee, INEOS indicate, well, they were unable to signal their intention to invest in Project Willow, despite being invited to do so. And you're correct in terms of the scale of the projects under Project Willow are not yet at the table, but the problem is that they won't come unless there's regulatory certainty and investment certainty. That will come from the UK government in terms of the regulatory certainty, and INEOS clearly have a role because it's their land. So again, your reflections on that. Thank you.
I think these are all really good questions that we're working through in the investment task force that we've set up. So we've got the cross-UK government task force looking at all the regulatory changes. And then we've got an investment task force that myself and Gillian Martin lead on, which is about looking at the investable propositions. It will also take a really sleeves rolled up approach to how do we get these over the line. So this is a very different way of thinking about the role of government in this. We want to actively engage with these potential investors to do what we can to get them over the line. And that does obviously mean conversations with INEOS about their role in that as well. I think clearly there is an opportunity for PetroChina and for INEOS to invest in any of these propositions. Obviously there's then the role of the INEOS as the landlord. But we also want to see if there are ways that these projects can be taken forward, even if INEOS isn't interested in that. I think what I would just say is I don't dismiss at all these points, which I think are really important, but we need to sort of get the investment propositions that are coming in to a point where we know what those actually look like before we can then go into some of the detail of what amount of land they require, what parts of the refinery might be able to be repurposed for some of it. These are the things we're trying to move as quickly as possible on so that we've got a real sort of plan for what the next few stages are going to look like.
And I'm keen to let my colleagues come in because I know we've only got you for an hour. My last question is, what commitment can you give today in terms of the Acorn carbon capture and storage project? I mean, there's been some quite extensive pre-trailing that the Chancellor of the Exchequer is going cold on Acorn specifically, yet continuing to proceed with Teesside and Humberside. Can you give us any update or indeed commitment today on the Acorn project?
I'm not going to do any trailing in your committee, but I'd say just what we have said, and it's really important to repeat this, is that the government is supportive of the Acorn project. The Secretary of State for Energy has been really clear in Parliament that we see it as a crucial part of how we deliver our decarbonisation journey for Scottish industry and energy. and that it's a really important investment proposition, but it is obviously a significant amount of public money, and it's right that it's for the spending review to make that decision. I haven't seen anything that has been trailing any view from the Chancellor. Our sense of it is that it is a serious part of our spending review bid, and it will be considered alongside everything else in the next few weeks and announced to Parliament in the usual way.
Okay, thank you, Convener.
Can I bring in Lorna Slater?
Thank you very much, Convener, and thank you very much, Minister, for coming to see us today. You're right, it is a nice reset with the new government coming in. I've got a question about how Grangemouth fits into wider energy strategy. So the Scottish Government does have a draft energy strategy, although that has been stalled for more than a year. But the idea of that is it shows where our energy in Scotland will be coming from, how much energy demand we'll need as we phase out and exit from the North Sea and move to zero-carbon energy systems. For example, that shows why we don't need nuclear in Scotland. Grangemouth has been floated for all sorts of things, including carbon capture and storage, which isn't a proven technology at scale, green hydrogen, blue hydrogen, biofuel for aviation, and so on. My question is, how does this fit into the wider energy strategy? Is the UK government developing an energy strategy along the lines of what the Scottish Government has done to chart that transition away from North Sea oil and gas, away from importation of fossil fuels toward that zero-carbon future? And how does Grangemouth fit into that? Because there's always a concern that, for example, CCUS does not work. It hasn't been proven to work at scale yet, that it's not a good investment. It's very expensive. That hydrogen doesn't live up to the potential that we think it might have, for example. And our worry would be that any investments in Grangemouth would therefore become white elephants and not be sustainable in the long term. So can you give us a bit of a story around what the UK's plan is for a wider energy strategy and how we fit into that?
Well, I always had you more as a glass half full person, Ms Slater. I think there is real potential in all of those technologies that you've outlined, but clearly they are innovative technologies, and I do think it's really important to recognise that. But there's no pathway to decarbonising all of our economy without carbon capture. So it does play a really critical role in those hard-to-abate sectors of industry. And crucially in this transition, and I think you rightly talk about the transition in the North Sea, it has to be a credible transition that recognises the role oil and gas will play for many decades to come, but that we're already in transition and have been for a long time. What we're determined to do is ramp up what comes next so that those jobs can move from one to another as seamlessly as possible, but we're also creating the next generation of jobs. Again, I would say this is something we should have been doing 10 years ago or longer, but it's something we're now moving at speed to put in place. The wider energy picture is partly our Clean Power mission, which we outlined in detail in the Clean Power Action Plan before Christmas, which has been a huge collaborative effort across the whole of the UK, particularly in Scotland, given the role that Scotland will play in offshore wind and in the really, as being right at the front of floating offshore wind, which is the economic opportunity of the century alongside the energy opportunity. We also want all of the jobs to come from the manufacturing of that infrastructure to Scotland as well, and that's why I've been spending so much time in the North East and also recently in the ports around Inverness, looking at how we bring those jobs here. But crucially, what has changed when we've come into government is that while I might profoundly disagree with the SNP on many things, on energy policy, we broadly have the same outcomes in mind. And so we have two governments working coherently on energy policy to achieve the same outcomes. Because while I've got responsibilities for things like renewables auctions, the Scottish Government has responsibility for planning. Those two things have to go hand in hand, or we're not going to deliver the clean power system that we need. And the final piece of the jigsaw I would just say is that while renewables are going to be the backbone of our energy system going forward, I think nuclear does have an absolutely critical role. And I think the ban on nuclear in Scotland has been a hugely problematic decision by the Scottish Government for many years. The next generation of small modular reactors present huge opportunities for new industries to come to Scotland, but also for us to deliver that capacity that isn't subject to changes in the weather conditions that we might have from solar and from wind. And I think nuclear plays a really important role, and I'll be pushing for as much policy change as possible so we can have new nuclear in Scotland.
I mean, the Minister, you've set out some political intentions there and some good intentions for outcomes. What I haven't heard is sort of a strategic planning. So, what we need is identification of sites and infrastructure like Grangemouth, looking forward to the future, saying, well, this site will need to transition, this site will need to be closed down, something will need to, there needs to be that actual plan instead of just setting intentions and hoping that we're going to go in the right direction. Will the UK be putting forward an energy strategy? And we're chasing the Scottish Government to get theirs published.
Yeah, sorry, that was the part of your question I didn't get to, and I do think it's really important. I would say there is here a bit of a division in responsibilities in that sort of detailed economic development and industrial policy is for the Scottish Government to drive forward. But clearly, we do want to have a UK-wide strategy around how we achieve our climate obligations and how we achieve decarbonisation across the UK. Partly, we've reset the cross-UK ministerial working groups, and one of the key elements that we've been talking about is actually how do we bring together all the various CCC reports in the different parts of the UK to come up with a holistic strategy for how we do this. We're probably not, as a UK government, going to get down to the level of individual sites, but we do think that ultimately for things like carbon capture to work, actually there does need to be a look at those really hard to abate parts of industry, which will mean a factory by factory, power station by power station approach to how we can decarbonise individual elements of it as much as possible. Grangemouth has a real opportunity as part of the Acorn cluster to deliver part of that, and that's why we're supportive of Acorn as a project.
Thank you, Convener.
Bring in Jamie Halcrow-Johnson for a brief supplementary.
Very brief supplementary. Thank you, Convener. Morning, Minister. It's really just on the kind of point. It's around critical energy infrastructure. You said that you would have liked to be having these conversations about Grangemouth about 5 years ago. Well, there is energy infrastructure, particularly in my region, the Highlands and Islands, that is going to be operating probably until the middle of the next decade. Flotter oil terminal being one. We've just seen job losses there, and it'll go into new ownership next year. I was just going to ask what lessons you've learned from the process around Grangemouth that you think will help make sure that we don't find ourselves in the same situation, and also what discussions and whether you're having discussions with operators of terminals like Flotter and others now to make sure that, as I say, we're not in the same situation as we find ourselves.
Yeah, thank you. I think that is a really important question, and there are lessons to learn. Of course, there are always lessons to learn from these decisions. I think one of the key lessons is that where we have had transitions from carbon-based industries to low-carbon industries, the long-term sustainability of the site and the workforce needs to be thought about as early on as possible. I'll give you a good example of where that has been done well in the UK. I was at the last coal power station in the UK at Ratcliffe and Soar. They spent, I think, almost 15 years planning that transition and making sure the workforce knew exactly what they were going into when it closed. And that is an example of a good transition, because we should recognise that there is already a transition underway. We've lost more than 70,000 jobs in the past 10 years in the oil and gas industry. That isn't just with the election of a new government last year. That's a long-term transition in the North Sea. So it does mean that things are going to change. There's no point pretending that everything will stay the same. But for the transition to be prosperous and just for the individual workforces, it means when something does close, those workers have got a clear pathway to what the future jobs will look like. And crucially for us, it's about how we retain that skill set within particularly the northeast of Scotland, where we know that a lot of the workforce has the flexibility to move abroad and take the skills with them. So it's critical for us that transition means a viable job that someone can take up and stay within Scotland and keep those skills within Scotland. That's partly why we worked with the Scottish Government on passporting, which has long been a challenge to get over the line, but so that if you have oil and gas experience in key areas that are also critically important to offshore wind, for example, you should be able to move straight into a job that does that, and for those skills and experiences to be recognised. And we're glad that we got that over the line. That's one small piece of the jigsaw, but it is one part of how we make this a just transition.
So can I just ask, are those conversations or that engagement happening on other sites already?
Well, I can't speak to individual sites, but generally, yes. And I've spent quite a lot of time in Aberdeen meeting individual companies to make sure we do have a really good idea of where there may be future challenges. We're obviously not going to get involved in individual commercial processes that are ongoing, but we want to be actively involved in this. It's also why in the consultation on the future of energy in the North Sea that just recently closed, which was largely about licensing policy, but it opened it up to be a really detailed, open conversation about what does the future of the North Sea look like, and how do we put in place a plan so that there is a transition plan for all of these various projects. So we're not looking at it piecemeal, one announcement after another, but looking holistically at the whole of the North Sea and driving forward the jobs and opportunities that come next.
Thank you, Convener.
Thanks, Jamie. Can I bring in Murdo Fraser?
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Minister. I want to ask you about how Grangemouth fits into the wider issue of energy security for the UK. And incidentally, I entirely agree with your comments on nuclear energy, which I think would be a useful part of the mix in Scotland. But we are now a net importer of oil and gas in the UK. Your government has decided that it will not grant licences for new oil and gas exploration in the North Sea, as my colleague just mentioned. Can you explain to me what the logic is in us importing oil and gas at a higher carbon cost, when that means we're going to be exporting the economic benefit and the jobs to other countries?
Well, firstly, it's important to separate out the consenting and licensing position. And as you rightly say, what we've said is we are minded to position in our manifesto was we won't allow new licences to explore new fields. Now, that's based on all the evidence that we've seen and that's outlined in great detail in the consultation that we've just concluded, which is that actually issuing new licences for exploration will make only a very marginal difference to actual output from the North Sea. It is a super mature basin. It is a declining basin. It's becoming more difficult and expensive to extract from the North Sea. And so what we want to do is shape a strategy that is about stewardship and management of the future of the North Sea. And I think there is recognition across the board that while we might disagree about timelines of it, the future in the long term of the North Sea is not oil and gas. And so we have to now ramp up the industries that come next that deliver those good, well-paid jobs. That's in CCUS, it's in hydrogen, it's in offshore wind, it's in floating offshore wind, and it's in technologies we probably can't imagine at this moment. But it also is about then managing the existing fields for the lifespan that they have a licence for, and that's what we've been really clear on. We're not removing any existing licences. And there could well be new consents for existing licensed fields. We've not said any policy against that. That's for individual projects to come forward for consent. But the long-term future, and we have seen this for many, many years, is that the North Sea is a declining basin. And so the decision we've taken is that rather than sort of burying our heads in the sand and pretending that this can continue as it has, with, as I say, more than 70,000 jobs lost in the past 10 years, we should actually put in place a plan that recognises the transition that is already happening and creates a plan for how we deliver the energy infrastructure of the future so that we can retain the skills in the North East of Scotland. And that's what we've decided to do.
OK, thanks for that, Minister. But would you agree with me there is no contradiction in trying to encourage a transition to renewable energy at the same time as making the maximum advantage of the resources we have? We will require oil and gas for decades to come. We're just going to have to import more if we don't produce at home. And your government is not granting consent to Rosebank and Jackdaw. That could provide a major contribution to oil and gas and support jobs in the North East economy. We've just seen Harbour Energy in Aberdeen announce the cut of 250 jobs. Today, the Scotsman newspaper is reporting an open letter from 2,500 energy workers, business leaders and others in the North East calling for an end to the windfall tax. Do you not accept that your government's current approach is devastating the North East economy, as these business leaders and others are claiming?
Well, I don't. And let me just firstly say on the consenting position is that I'm not going to comment, obviously, on what a future Jackdaw and Rosebank application might look like, because my department will decide on that. But it is important to separate out licensing from consenting. The decisions in Jackdaw and Rosebank were decided by a court to have been illegally made by the previous government. There is a process that we moved quickly on to respond to the Scope 3 emissions question, the so-called Finch judgment. We did that very quickly with industry. We're now coming up with what that consenting process will look like to meet the requirements of what the Supreme Court has ruled on. And then it will be for individual operators to resubmit applications should they wish to do so, and we'll then decide on them. So I think it is important to separate out those two questions. But on the wider point, we have been a net importer for a very long time. This isn't a sudden transition because of a Labour manifesto commitment. What we are saying is that we either accept that that transition is underway and start working seriously on how we put in place plans to keep jobs in the North Sea in future industries, or we keep having announcements like the hugely disappointing one you just said, that is without having a plan across government. Now, we could have been doing this 10 years ago when we knew the North Sea was a declining basin and jobs were going. We haven't. We're now playing catch-up, and we're determined to move as quickly as possible. And to take your point, and I agree with you in many respects, oil and gas will play a crucial part in the transition. We're not going to suddenly have no oil and gas in our economy, and a lot of that will continue to come from the North Sea, but it's not a long-term proposition, and it's a responsible government plans for what comes next.
OK, so what is your message, therefore, to the 2,500 people from the north east of Scotland who've just signed this open letter that's reported in the media today, saying you need to rethink your approach to the windfall tax and to the grant of new licences because it is devastating for the north east economy? Are you just telling them they need to suck it up?
No, I would never say that. And I've been in the North East speaking to many, many of these people almost every month I've been in this job. So that's not ever been my message to them. What I would say is, on the EPL, which was introduced by the previous government, expanded a number of times by the previous government, we've been really clear it will come to an end, and we consulted on what the future of the Energy Profits Levy should look like, so that there is a long-term understanding of what the tax base should look like for oil and gas. That consultation, I think, has only just closed or is about to close, and we'll then analyse all the responses to that. Clearly, tax policy is considered by the Chancellor. I'm not going to announce any views on tax policy in this committee, but I think we do need to look at this in the round. I mean, when we took a huge amount of feedback on board from industry in the last budget, and we took forward their recommendations in terms of the capital allowances, which was included in the budget, and industry warmly welcomed it. So this isn't a government that hasn't been listening to industry, but we do have to balance both the questions the industry will always raise about tax, and I understand those questions, with the wider public finances as they currently sit, with the need to invest in public services across the country, the need to end austerity. That is a balancing act that the Chancellor has to make every single week. Clearly, industry will take their own view on this. We're trying to make sure we get the balance right, and the consultation conclusion on the EPL will give long-term certainty to what taxation should look like.
All right, thank you.
Ian Gordon-MacDonald.
Thanks very much, Convener. Good morning, Minister. I've got one question about energy security, and then I've got another area I want to ask you about. Grangemouth was important for Scotland's security needs, fuel security needs, and they supplied roughly 65% of the fuel requirements for Scotland. As we move into being an import terminal, do you see those levels remaining at the same levels as of the 65%? And Stanlow Refinery is expanding with a £500 million investment to handle increased demand predominantly from Scotland. So how do you see the future going forward?
Yeah, I might ask Camilla to come in on some of the details of this, but one of the pieces of work that Camilla and the Scottish Government team have been doing really since the beginning of us being concerned about Grangemouth has been looking at what the fuel supply question will look like, and that's got a number of different parts to it in terms of specific fuels that came from Grangemouth, but also the broader question around fuel security in Scotland has obviously been one that we have been putting a serious amount of thought into from the very beginning of this process, even when we were hoping to continue refining Grangemouth for much longer. But I might ask Camilla to come in on some of the details of your question.
Well, thank you, Minister, and thank you, Mr MacDonald. I think one of the first things to say on the kind of energy security question is the perception that the shift from refining to importing is a really, really significant change. I think actually Grangemouth was already importing more than 90% of the crude oil it was refining anyway. It generally wasn't taking crude from the North Sea. So it has been functioning as an import terminal in some ways anyway, successfully for many years. As it became clear that they were going to close the refining operation, we worked really closely with that company to make sure that they have robust plans in place. We talked about their storage, we talked about their supply chains. And we've worked really robustly with the Scottish Government. I think we've done much more and deeper analysis on this than we have of any other kind of refining scenario. And we feel really confident that businesses and consumers in Scotland will continue to have robust fuel supplies. The fact that other refineries are looking to expand and compete, I think, can only be a good thing. Competition is good for consumers. But in the short term, we're not expecting any significant change to fuel security or to fuel supplies.
But EET Fuels, who own Stanlow Refinery, has said that they hope to expand their customer base into Scotland, and that's why they're investing £500 million on the site.
I'm sure they are. I'm sure they're hopeful that they will be able to compete with Grangemouth and offer lower prices to consumers, but there's no reason that Grangemouth couldn't continue to compete in that space and to continue to hold market share.
I'll move on to the other area that I wanted to ask you about. Minister, you mentioned the National Wealth Fund, the £200 million. Where did that figure come from?
I'm sorry?
How did you arrive at £200 million?
Well, I think 200 million, it's worth saying if an investable... So the National Wealth Fund processes, it looks at individual projects and reaches investment decisions on them. This is the first time the National Wealth Fund has ever made a preemptive decision to ring-fence some money. I think if propositions came forward that were an investable proposition that required more than that, the National Wealth Fund would look at it. So this isn't a cap. It is a figure that we're saying is an absolute commitment that £200 million is on the table to invest in propositions that come forward. Now, they have to then be, obviously analysed and a serious amount of testing that they fit with the National Wealth Fund's requirements and a whole range of other things. But we want this to be a sustainable option, so it's not a £200 million grant to build something. It's £200 million of investment alongside the private sector, which is how we ensure whatever comes next at Grangemouth is sustainable. But it's not an absolute limit on the ambition the NWF might put into this, but that's dependent on projects that come forward.
So the £200 million is not a ceiling, but how far would it go to make any of the Project Willow options viable?
Well, I think just on the ceiling point, it is just important to say that the NWF makes investment decisions based on individual projects. So I'm not, as a minister, I have no decision-making role in that whatsoever. The government has taken this unprecedented decision to work with the NWF to ring-fence funding. And it's worth just saying the reason for that isn't because of just the refinery closing. It is also because we see Grangemouth as being a hugely important industrial and economic opportunity. It's got so many factors in its favour, and so the NWF took the view that propositions that come forward to be cited there will meet with its overall sort of goals on behalf of the British people, and therefore the £200 million is the ring-fence figure on the table. So it's not for me to say if they would go what level they might go higher to. That's for the NWF to look at, but £200 million is what we have committed to at the moment. And I think the question about the Willow proposals, or importantly to say, it's not restricted to Willow proposals. So if other propositions came forward that we think deliver good jobs and an industrial opportunity for the site, then the NWF will consider that as well. Clearly, it's not going to deliver those projects entirely, but it will play a really important role in driving forward the private sector investment. And of the 66 projects that have bid in already, I think what is clear is that commitment from the government has been one of the drivers in saying, well, we might consider the Grangemouth site when we haven't before. It's the sort of cornerstone funder that gets them in the door, but we will need considerable amounts of private sector investment to make any of the propositions for that site happen, and that's why it's got to be a partnership.
So the £200 million is effectively match funding. How much of it's been released so far?
Well, it's dependent on propositions coming forward, as I've said. So it won't release funding until there is a viable investment proposition on the table. I think that's quite important, actually, because what we don't want to do is pour money into something that we don't think is a viable long-term opportunity. What we don't need is another sort of short-term investment there that gives the workforce and the community even more uncertainty. We need it to be a long-term proposition that delivers good jobs long into the future. So that proposition has to be on the table before the NWF will consider it.
If I might just add one point on that as well, I think the nature of the National Wealth Fund funding is that it won't come in until, projects are quite mature proposals. And this is part of the way we're working with the Scottish Government, who announced 25 million in the short term, which is much more readily available for kind of seed funding. And we're hoping that by working together, we can kind of ensure that funding helps to support proposals so that they're ready to be pitched to the National Wealth Fund. So I think it's working as intended so far.
Okay, so you've said it's a long-term proposition. It's anticipated no Project Willow options will be underway before 2030, and job levels won't reach the same level as refineries before 2040. What happens to the skilled workforce in the short term?
Well, this is why we've been saying there's two different prongs to this approach. One is obviously to get forward these future propositions as quickly as possible. The other is to support the workforce as it currently stands. That's why just today we've announced the number of workers that have commenced training. I think almost all of the workforce has completed an assessment process with Forth Valley College to look at what their training needs are. And a number of local employers have already taken on a number of the staff from the refinery, and I think the majority of the apprentices have been kept on in different roles within the site. So there are a range of different things we've been working at. Clearly, this is the point I was saying, and my regret earlier to Ms Thompson is that if we had been commencing this work 5-10 years ago, then we could have had some of these projects moving forwards before the refinery closed. That hasn't happened, and my sort of learning from the past 9 months is that you don't get to choose the cards in front of you. You just have to deal with them, and that is where we're at. So we're doing everything we can to support the workforce and everything we can to speed up the investment. And I would just reiterate a point I made earlier. The whole government has focused on this problem in a way that we have not focused on really industrial issues for a very long time in this way, of right across government, ministers spending time on individual parts of this project. I know the Cabinet Secretary has been doing the same as I, which is having individual conversations with investors to try and get them over the line. There is a real collaborative approach to make this happen and a real commitment to make it happen, but it will take time. You're absolutely right. And the build out of what comes next will take a number of years, but we want that to commence as quickly as possible. And of course, there are jobs created in the construction of some of these opportunities as well before they're actually up and running.
So my last point, and I'll leave it to your Labour colleague Brian Leishman, who said, "I've been told that the government has no plans to stop the INEOS project in Antwerp with £600 million loan guarantee to stop that money, even though INEOS plans to close the Grangemouth refinery with the loss of thousands of jobs. Why is there £600 million for Antwerp and not Grangemouth? And why would the government allow that to happen and not use the £600 million as leverage with INEOS to avoid Scottish job losses?" And that's from your colleague.
Well, I think first to say that a guarantee is very different from the direct funding that is on the table from the National Wealth Fund. So there is direct investment on the table. I'm not aware of exactly where that decision is at on Antwerp. I don't think it has proceeded at all. Camilla might know the details, but I think that there is a very different circumstance. And I would also just say we have had a number of conversations with both PetroChina and INEOS on their involvement in this project. We have had some very robust conversations about the decisions that they have taken. It is a commercial decision, as hugely disappointing as it is, that they have taken. And we have been working genuinely tirelessly to make sure that decision had support for the workforce, but also to push them to continue refining as much as possible. We've asked them that repeatedly. On the question of Antwerp, I don't know if, Camilla, you've got the details of where that's at.
Yeah, I think this relates to a kind of UK export finance loan guarantee that was agreed some time ago. I think the key point, as the Minister has said, is that this isn't money being given to a company. No taxpayers' money is being spent. It's a guarantee. but also that those kind of export finance decisions are taken kind of independently based on the merits of each case. So it's not the same as kind of taking money away from Grangemouth.
It's still a threat if you threaten to remove it, because it's if it didn't require the loan guarantee, it wouldn't have asked for it, and therefore you had leverage to try and get more out of INEOS than you currently have. And therefore, why didn't you use that leverage? Because that £600 million loan guarantee was obviously required by INEOS in order to invest in Antwerp, and you haven't done anything to try and get leverage about it in order to save jobs at Grangemouth.
First of all, it's important to say Grangemouth is a joint venture, so it's not INEOS on its own. It has its own corporate structure as a joint venture with PetroChina. And second, yes, but that's by definition then it's not entirely INEOS. But secondly, the government doesn't act in that way in any case. We don't hold decisions of different parts of governments in that way, and I don't think you would expect government, perhaps you would, but I think most wouldn't expect government to operate in that way. But the other thing I would say is that it was a decision of the previous government, and it's an export finance decision, not a national wealth fund decision or a government decision. And as I say, I don't even know if it is still progressing. I haven't had an update on it. But I would just make the final point, Mr MacDonald, on this, which is to say that it is unprecedented for the UK government to ring-fence money in advance of any actual investment proposition being on the table. That is an absolute commitment from this government to Grangemouth that we have not made to any other place in any other industrial proposition. And I would just reiterate that is because of the opportunity that exists on the Grangemouth site, but also how seriously we recognise the challenges.
Bob Doris.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning, Minister. I was pleased to hear you say that you want to do everything you can to speed up investment. So I want to make some suggestions to you and see things we could do now. I also sit in the Net Zero Committee. Yesterday we heard from 5 energy companies plus the General Manager of the Acorn project in relation to hydrogen economy and Project Willow. One of the major barriers is that for green hydrogen, over 70% of their costs relate to electricity costs, and these can be brought down, as some suggestions were made. I'm conscious there's a review of the electricity market arrangements more generally taking place in the UK. There's direct action that could be taken to dramatically reduce the cost to produce green hydrogen, which is a key barrier to getting that investment that we want to see. What's happening in relation to that, Minister?
Well, on two fronts, so I'll come to REMA in a second. The broader work of government is obviously around reducing electricity prices through the Clean Power Mission. So we're doing everything we can to build that infrastructure as fast as possible. And every solar panel or wind turbine that we switch on, we push gas off as the marginal price setter. And of course, that marginal price setter of gas has been why we are paying so much in our electricity bill. So that work continues at pace with good collaboration with the Scottish Government on driving that forward. The REMA question that we inherited from the previous government is now down to really a decision about a reform to national pricing or zonal pricing. We have done a lot of details.
I'm really sorry, and it's not my nature to cut across people during giving evidence to committee, so I apologise for doing that. It's only because I've got time constraints on me in relation to my questioning. Rather than extended, I know I mentioned REMA, but the point I was trying to make is what actions can the UK government take now to reduce the electricity costs for green hydrogen? So rather than an extended, and I'm not being discourteous, an extended explanation of what REMA is, what is the UK government doing to reduce electricity costs for green hydrogen? Because that's what the 5 energy companies and Acorn project wanted to know.
Well, forgive me, you asked me about REMA, so I apologise for giving an answer about it. I mean, that clearly is a decision that we're taking, and I've outlined already that the wider work of government is all about reducing electricity bills for consumers and for industry.
Okay, so no specific actions at the moment. We got one suggestion made to reduce costs for green hydrogen, and that was if we could blend green hydrogen into the existing gas networks, it could reduce costs by up to 30%. That's something that could be actively considered now and taken forward. Is it something that the UK government is actively looking at?
Yeah, we are actively looking at blending, and there are some decision points coming up on that. I think there's there's a balance to be struck. So there's been a detailed bit of evidence gathering about the degree to which you can blend without having an impact on the end users. So a part of the system can be blended without having much impact at all. So we're looking at what the decision could be and how we move that forward. If you go much further on blending, you do start to get to a point where industrial users would have to change some of their equipment at the end of it. So there's a sort of balance there, but we're broadly in favour of some kind of blending. We're just looking at how that decision point will be made, and I think I can write to the committee on timescales, but that is something we're actively considering.
I think that would be really helpful. I think it's about 20% in blending before you start to have to look at infrastructure and changing the pipe network. Can I ask about Project Union, the 1,500 transmission grid, pipeline grid for hydrogen that's been looked at? We were asked, I think it was by the General Manager of the Acorn project yesterday, my apologies if it was a different witness, could we put pressure on the Scottish Government to put pressure on the UK Government to give certainty in relation to when the Scottish part of that will be complete? Understand the next leg is going to be in Scotland. We're hooking up the Acorn project, the Grangemouth cluster and other grid networks. They say that without a commitment to carbon capture at Acorn, but also that grid infrastructure, that pipework infrastructure, it's really compromising the investment that we all want to see. And again, I think you said everything we can do to speed up investment was possible. So it would really help industry and it would help investors if UK Government could say Project Union in Scotland means this will happen by date X, and that's what it will look like. That would bring investment into the sector now. Is there any clarity you can give on that, either just now or maybe follow up in writing, perhaps, Minister?
Yeah, I think if it's okay, I will follow up in writing. I'm not directly the Minister responsible for hydrogen, so I think it would be better if I speak to my colleague Sarah Jones and we get a response to the committee.
Okay, Convener, I have no further questions other than just to put on the record that if we can reduce electricity costs for green hydrogen, if we can blend into the existing gas network, and if we can secure carbon capture and Project Union for Scotland, it could transform key elements of Project Willow, and the market and the investors need certainty and they need it to be quick, Minister. So anything you can put in concrete and writing would be incredibly helpful.
Thank you very much. You're right, Bob, it's not a question, but it's on the record now. Can I bring in Claire Baker?
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Minister. In advance of this morning's meeting, I had a look back at previous sessions we've had, so back to 2023, when Neil Gray, who was the Cabinet Secretary at the time, came to give evidence. So this was following the announcement of the closure in November. So at the time, the Cabinet Secretary said, "We are talking about a century-old refinery that has had issues, where significant interventions have been made in the past and where the joint venture has provided a significant subsidy for a number of years. Therefore, the announcement was not a great surprise to us, and I do not think it should have been to others." So the question is, was it a surprise for you when you came into office that there was no transition plan in place for Grangemouth? And I think we're actually still waiting on the Scottish Government's Just Transition Plan for Grangemouth. Now, I hear what you're saying about positive working relationships, but how quick or how easy was it to start that relationship and get things actually moving?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think look, the truth is we've all known, because it's been very public for a very long time in Scotland, how precarious the situation has been at Grangemouth. This isn't just something that's occurred in the last few years, so there have been a number of opportunities to look at this question. I think the age of the refinery is important. It is a 100-year-old refinery. The economics of it have been very difficult for a very long time. The amount of imports that it relies on means that its place in the wider oil and gas story in Scotland is different as well. But the truth is that we came in on day one, and I think it was the very first thing that was presented to me in my entry as a minister as an impending problem. Now, that didn't just occur because there was a general election. Clearly, it had been on the desks of ministers before and not picked up. And what I would say is genuinely, and I have many disagreements with the Scottish Government on things, but from the get-go, we did put the politics at the door and meet and try and find a solution. Project Willow is a really kind of tangible example of that, a proposition that had been on the table for some time but not funded. That we decided to immediately fund with the Scottish Government. And we have been working really closely since then with hopefully as much of the politics out of it as possible. And that's really important for obvious reasons, but not least because the skills part of what we've been trying to do is devolved. But I think there is a wider lesson here around the transition more generally, is that we do need to have serious plans in place for all of this, and that isn't just the UK government, it's the responsibilities that the Scottish Government has as well.
Could you maybe say a bit more about Project Willow and how decisions have been made? I think you said that Scottish Enterprise were the organisation who were taking the lead on it, and others have talked about the timescale. So there's 9 options on the table. How will it be decided? Because a lot of it seems based on what new technologies, what will be feasible. So I don't know if you want to say a bit more about how decisions are going to be made.
Yeah, and again, I might ask Camilla to come in on some of this. So we've set up various groups across government. One group is looking at all the policy recommendations that have come from Project Willow that are the responsibility of the UK government. I presume the Scottish Government is doing likewise with the policy recommendations that are devolved. And then there's a second group which is looking at the investment propositions themselves, which meets formally for the first time today, but we've been meeting informally, myself and Gillian Martin, for some time. And it's really about kicking the tyres on the propositions that have come forward, but also seeing what more can government do to get those over the line. The Office for Investment, which is based in the Department for Business and Trade, is involved. And Scottish Enterprise as an agency has been the sort of front door, I suppose, where propositions can come in and make their pitch. And they're also doing some of the early due diligence on what are credible options and what are not. But really, it's a collaborative effort to try and get a combination, probably, of investments across the line. Camilla might want to come in more of the kind of detailed proposals.
Yeah. And I would just say, as an official, I've never seen anything like this in terms of ways of working. So to have the 2 governments, National Wealth Fund, Scottish National Investment Bank, Office for Investment, Scottish Enterprise, all in a room working at kind of feverish pace is really, really different. And it does feel like a major lift. In terms of how decisions will get taken, obviously, neither government is really the decision maker. It's because we need to work with the landlords, not just INEOS, but all the landlords that have potential parcels of land available, and the potential investors. And it might well be that it's not just one investor, it might be a cluster. So the kind of micro decisions we're taking now is around due diligence. It's around, when should ministers be deployed? When do we use our overseas network to kind of promote these opportunities? But the kind of crunchy decisions for government will be around, the point at which proposals are ready to apply for National Wealth Fund support, and also around policy. So if there are specific investment proposals that rely on one or more of the proposals that EY put forward in Project Willow, we will be looking to kind of accelerate those and see what's in the art of the possible to make the changes happen. But really, I think this is a huge effort from both governments, and if there's an investor out there, I'm confident we'll find them.
Thank you, Convener.
Thanks very much. Can I bring in Stephen Kerr?
Thank you, Convener. Minister, although I'm not a member of the committee, I'm grateful to the Convener for allowing me the opportunity to ask a question. I was a little perturbed by the answer you gave to Michelle Thompson about Petro INEOS's position in relation to its role as a landowner and a landlord. I was particularly perturbed with what I picked up as a discussion you've not yet had with Petro INEOS, apparently, about their willingness to fulfil their part in all of this, which is to make that land available in a state that it can be properly developed. Did I pick you up wrong, or are you saying that that's not a discussion you've yet had?
No, and if that's the impression I gave, then let me clarify. I have, of course, spoken to INEOS about that question. What I was saying was that there's a sort of top-level conversation about a willingness to cooperate on projects, and then there is a detailed conversation about an individual project and the space that they might want to take up. Those are two different conversations.
Are you totally satisfied that there is a commitment on the part of Petro INEOS to redevelop that land as a landowner and as a landlord? Or is there any doubt at all about their intention?
Well, it's not for me to say what INEOS's intentions are. What I've been really clear on...
You've had a conversation with them, and it's important for my constituents to hear that that commitment is on the table from Petro INEOS. Is that commitment on the table or not?
Well, let me answer the question, which is to say it's for INEOS to make those kind of commitments. But from my meetings with them, we've been very clear they will have to be part of that conversation. And they have indicated that they do want to see investments come forward and develop the site. What I can't say is that they've committed to individual parcels of land for individual projects before those projects have actually materialised. So there's a process we're going through here. We need to get investors in the door first and foremost. They need to come forward with propositions. And then those propositions, we then need to look at what land do they need. Some will be on INEOS's land, some will be on other landowners' land, and then we make sure that those projects can be taken forward. I don't think it's credible for me to say, before we even know what the project might look like, we expect a landowner to make a decision, and that's not what we've asked them at this stage.
It would be highly credible if you, as a Minister of the Crown, was able to say you'd have a conversation with a private business that has undertaken in relation to Project Willow, which it commissioned. PetroIneos was the commissioner of Project Willow, even though it was paid for by public money. It would be very helpful to hear you say that in relation to all of the 9 potential projects, that they are committed to making that happen on that space that they own, on that land they own. You don't seem to be able to say that, and I find that somewhat concerning.
Well, can I just say that they have given a commitment that they want to take forward these projects. What I can't do as a Minister of the Crown, as you put it, is sit here and say what a decision of a private company's board might be on individual decisions. I can say from our part, we have engaged with them really closely. I mean, officials, I think, spent almost every week with INEOS in the development of Project Willow, because this has been a close collaborative approach. We will push them, of course, when there's a proposition on the table to make sure that happens. If they are a barrier to that, we'll work to break through that. But I can't sit here and say to you what the commercial decision of INEOS is right now.
But the real risk is someone works up a proposition, a proposal around investing in one of these 9 projects, and then they are told, oh no, PetroIneos say, oh no, that's not going to happen on this land. That's the point I'm getting at. The role of government in this situation is to, as far as possible, de-risk these situations. Are you satisfied that the UK and Scottish governments have done enough to de-risk this for potential investors, given the discussion we're having about the use of that land?
Yeah, and I think that is the right way to put it. We have done everything we can, and we will continue to do. There's much more to do. This is not done yet. We're doing everything we can to get investments over the line. There will then be conversations, and look, I'm the same as I suspect Gilly Martin. We are both very willing to roll up our sleeves and have that conversation with PetroIneos, with INEOS about the site, and we will do that. But there is a process here around. We have to know what that proposition looks like first of all, and of course the Willow projects are all very different in scope and size, the amount of site they need, the part of the site they might need, and there are other propositions coming forward that might utilise other parts of the Grangemouth site. So I think I appreciate that this is a sort of chicken and egg approach about what bit we do first. We have laid the groundwork as clearly as we can to get the commitment from INEOS that they want to take forward projects on their site. We will look for what those investable propositions are, and then we will drive those forward. And any barriers that are in the way to make that happen, you can be absolutely assured that this government will do whatever we can to move them out of the way. I'm just not saying right now that we think INEOS is one of those barriers, because we haven't been able to put specific projects to them.
There are lots of questions about these projects. The convener's given me the
one more question then, Stephen.
So, I mean, I just say that there are lots of questions about each of these, about the 9 potential projects around feedstock, around biodiversity, food security, the whole supply chain setup, which we don't have time to look at. Can I ask the Minister one final question, which is this? And I do appreciate the opportunity to ask these questions, convener. The official said that £25 million from the Scottish Government was more readily available for seed corn investment. To use for seed corn investment. Why is the £200 million not more readily available for that kind of activity? Because that's the kind of activity right now that might give pace to these projects.
Well, partly it's the National Wealth Fund will invest in a proposition as it stands at the point where it comes forward for investment. So if there are works that need to be carried out to get any of these projects to the line, that's what the Scottish Government money has been committed to do. But the truth is that if an investable proposition came forward that required investment in land or in the sites, Sorry, we've just had an error on the screen there. Investment in the site. That is where the National Wealth Fund money could come in. So it's not as if you need the project to be built and constructed before the NWF would fund it. What we do need is for the project to be mature and developed, and then the NWF will put money on the table to actually help build it.
And that costs money, of course. And we're trying to de-risk this process so that investors will come forward with those propositions, because they all carry massive risk, whether it's the land, whether it's the supply chain, whether, you know, there's a whole bunch of issues here which create uncertainties which we need to minimise. I think I've said enough. Thank you.
You've summed it up well, Stephen. You've said enough. Thank you so much indeed for your contribution. Minister, just one final question for myself. We've touched on this issue already, but Eni has told this committee that to avoid the loss of refining at Grangemouth, the UK and Scottish governments should have acted 5 years ago. It was clear from the report this committee did on our just transition at Grangemouth that both governments did not have a plan in place for Grangemouth, despite the warnings that were very clear. What lessons are the new government learning from those mistakes? Because there will be industrial sites across the country that will need to go through a transition period, and it's very clear that there's work at a pace at the moment in Grangemouth. That didn't happen early enough. What specific policy lessons is the new government learning to make sure those mistakes are not repeated at other sites across the country?
Thank you, Convener. I think it's a really important question. That's one that we are tackling right across government, because, you know, there's been a lot of discussion about the inheritance that you receive when you come in as a new government. Some of that was the fiscal black hole, but a lot of the challenge has actually just been problems that have been stored up and not dealt with for far too long. And I think the big reflection for us as a government is that the way we're trying to tackle some of these long-term problems is, first of all, for government to be far more actively involved in the detail of some of these issues, and taking them seriously as early as we know about them. But the second is around, look, we're not agnostic about the question of industrial policy, which the previous government was. We think industrial policy matters, and government has to be a driver in that. And that's what we will announce in a few weeks' time in the first credible industrial policy in a very, very long time, around what our detailed work will be right across government. And it's also why we've set up publicly owned finance institutions to help drive investment in where we think there needs to be greater investment than the private sector might think to put in capital at the moment. The National Wealth Fund is a really good example of that. Great British Energy is another example of that, specifically in the energy space, because, you know, there is a transition underway. I think things like carbon capture are critical for how we support difficult to abate industries for a long time in the work that they're doing, and hopefully to find other decarbonisation journeys. The electrification of industry will take time, but in the interim, that transition needs to be able to support the workforce that are there now to keep the skills and the talent that we have right across the country, and that's what planning for that transition matters. And so that's why I say the work we're doing at pace on a plan for the future of energy in the North Sea is critical, so that we grasp these challenges right now and have a plan for how we deal with them. But that's not about saying that we bury our heads in the sand and say a transition isn't underway. It is. There's huge opportunities that come from that, but only if we get it right, and that work has to start now. My view is that it should have started a long time ago, but we're now picking up the pace and hopefully working with industry, with trade unions, with the workforces, putting in place a credible plan for how we deliver the jobs and opportunities of the future.
Thank you very much for that, Minister. And that brings us to the end of our evidence session. Thank you to both Minister and Ms Perry for joining us today. I appreciate we've kept you longer than we promised, but the contribution questions have been very helpful to the work of the committee. I now suspend this meeting and move into private session.